and how atoms are bonded together to form molecules, and how those molecules can eventually be used to form the cell, which is our smallest unit of life. Eventually in this class, we will be moving on to how cells can form tissues, how those tissues can form organs, how organs form body systems, an organism, and eventually we'll move our way around to ecosystems. But in this unit, we will be focusing small. We're going to start off very small, and mainly today we'll be talking about atoms and molecules. The next image you had, I did not get a good printout of, but basically what you have is at the center you had a small little dot, and you kind of had this fuzzy image around it. And in the other one, you had the same kind of small dot, a almost perfect circle, and some little dots on the outside. What we're looking at here in these images are images of atoms. We have this kind of cloud molecule, so we're showing you this is the center or nucleus of that atom, and here's the little electron cloud floating around it. Then in the other image, it's the same image, but just showing you a slightly different description. The circles here are showing you the orbitals, or the very outer orbital of the atom and of where the electrons would be located. So, first thing that we need to talk about are atoms. And you need to know that an atom is a unit of any element. Okay? So, the smallest unit, or the smallest unit of matter, really, atoms are going to build up every other molecule. Now, in an atom, there's actually 3 parts within an atom, and we call those subatomic particles. So, pieces within the atom. We have, first of all, the protons, which are positively charged, and they contain, or they make up half of the mass of the atom itself. The second subatomic particle is called the neutron, and the neutron has no mass, no charge, and also has the other half of the mass of the atom. These 2 particles, the protons and the neutrons, are found within the nucleus of the atom. So here, within the center portion here, that's where you would see the protons and the neutrons. So in this example, we actually have hydrogen with 1 proton. It actually has 0 neutrons, and it has 1 electron. Okay? And so the electron is going to be our 3rd subatomic particle. So number 3 will be our electrons. The electrons are negatively charged, and they are actually so small in comparison to the protons and neutrons that we'll basically say that they make up no mass of the atom itself. Now with electrons, there's some properties of electrons that we need to keep in mind. Electrons are going to be attracted to the positive nucleus. And that should make sense to you because we only have protons and neutrons inside of the nucleus of the atom. And because neutrons are neutral, they have no charge, the positive proton will make up the majority of the charge in the center of the atom. Another property that we need to keep in mind, or characteristic of electrons, is that they repel each other. So thinking back to magnets, okay, opposites attract, like charges repel. And then one of the last things is that they are going to be constantly in motion. So remember that I said that this first image that you have represents an electron cloud. Those electrons are constantly moving around each other. The reason, so protons and neutrons, although they are very important to the atom, we really focus mainly on the electrons. So the number of electrons that we have will actually determine the, we can say, behavior of the atom. And really what we're thinking about when we say behavior, and I use that term loosely, is we're thinking of how does it bond, or will it bond? What will it try to bond to? And one of the main rules or reasonings to how it bonds is what's known as the octet rule. Okay? The octet rule says that on the outer shell of the atom, it wants to have 8 what are known as valence electrons. And if it gets those 8 valence electrons, it becomes very stable. So when we talk about the valence electrons, those are just the electrons that are on the outermost shell, because there can be several shells of electrons, or several orbitals, several orbitals, but on the outermost orbital of the electron, the atom itself will want, or will have the likelihood of trying to have those 8 valence electrons. So, and when we look at the periodic table of elements, we can actually notice some patterns here. Now for us, in this class, we will be mainly focusing on the elements CHNOPS. And this is biology, and this is the study of life, so this should make sense to you, because from Bio 1 we know that CHNOPS are the 6 essential elements to life. Okay? But within these 6 elements, we are going to focus mainly on hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. So CHO is what we're really looking at. When we first look at the periodic table of elements, the order of them does create a certain pattern. When we look at hydrogen, we know that hydrogen has 1 electron. And remember, we're talking about electrons because they help guide us in knowing the likelihood of whether or not these atoms will try to make bonds. And hydrogen atoms only have 1 electron total. So on their outer shell, they just have this 1 electron. So its goal really is to try to get 2 electrons. It's never really going to be able to reach 8 electrons. And it is actually very likely to form a bond with another element. An example of this is that it can bond to itself as hydrogen gas, so that would be H2. Now, on this outer end here, we have what are called the noble gases. These are not very reactive at all. But when we're looking at carbon, notice that's in the middle here, it actually contains 4 valence electrons, and it will actually want to form 4 bonds. Okay? So carbon can actually form 4 bonds with another element like hydrogen. In this molecule right here, carbon is going to be happy because it gets the 4 bonds that it wants. And then each of these hydrogen atoms are going to be happy because they get to form that 1 extra bond that they want. And therefore, they will actually get to fill their orbital with the 2 electrons. Okay? But then we have oxygen, and oxygen has 6 valence electrons. Okay? And that means it's really, really close to filling the octet rule. And because it's really close to filling the octet rule, it will very aggressively try to bond. Okay, aggressively bonds. It really wants to complete that octet. And we call this electronegativity. And electronegativity just means the likelihood or the affinity that atom has to other electrons. So how likely is it going to try to bond to other electrons? Okay? And when these molecules are bonding, there's actually two types of bonds that we want to focus on. So these are two types of molecular bonds. This first picture right here is going to represent a hydrogen atom, and the second is going to represent a chlorine atom. These two atoms can form together, or can join together in a bond known as an ionic bond. In an ionic bond, one atom is going to almost completely donate an electron, and the other one is going to receive one electron. Okay? So in this example, hydrogen and chlorine, chlorine is going to be more electronegative. It's closer to filling that octet rule. And so it's actually going to pull on the electron that the hydrogen has. And when it does that, it actually creates ions. An ion is an atom with a charge. So what really happens, if you look in this picture, the electron from the hydrogen atom actually gets pulled over into that orbital of the chlorine, and it's going to spend most of its time over there. So because of that, the hydrogen loses the negative electron and becomes slightly more positive in an ion called a cation. Okay? Positively charged, and that's what that little T there can help you remember. Whereas our chlorine atom, because it pulls over the electron, it becomes slightly more negatively charged. And this is known as an anion, an atom with a negative charge. So remember, ions are just charged electrons. Okay? Another thing that we need to keep in mind about an ionic bond is that it is kind of easily distracted, which really means that that bond isn't completely stable. So it can break apart fairly easily. So besides our example of HCl, hydrochloric acid, we can also have sodium chloride as another example. And notice both of them have chlorine. The hydrogen would be positive, chlorine would be negative. The sodium would be positive, chlorine would be negative. On the other hand, we have what's known as a covalent bond. Okay? And in a covalent bond, the electrons are shared. Okay? And generally, this means that this is going to be more stable and long-lasting. However, even when they're being shared, sometimes that sharing is not going to be equal. So if the sharing, and we'll just write this up here, so if there's not equal sharing, if one atom is more electronegative, then it's going to create a polar bond. And on the other hand, if both atoms are equally electronegative, then we'll create a non-polar covalent